My name is Myra Spencer. I'm 36 years old, and for 14 years I have stitched up strangers at 3 in the morning without my hands ever once shaking. A year after my divorce, I was finishing a shift near the maternity ward when my ex-mother-in-law cornered me by the elevators. Carol Bishop had a smile that looked like a door closing in your face. She walked up close enough that I could smell her perfume, and she said it loud enough for 2 nurses and a janitor to hear. Leaving you was the best decision my son ever made. Now he has a baby boy. With your best friend. 6 years of being called the broken one, folded into a single sentence, fired at point-blank range. I didn't flinch. I looked at her the way I look at a monitor that's lying to me, and I asked, "Is that what you believe?" 5 minutes later, a man neither she nor my best friend ever expected to see again walked through that door. And the one name nobody in that family wanted spoken out loud was about to be read into a courtroom record. Welcome back to NS Revenge Stories, where quiet women outlast loud cruelty and the truth always collects on time. If you like your justice slow, clean, and undeniable, get comfortable. Tell me where you're watching from and subscribe before we start, because you will want to see how this ends. Let me take you back those 5 minutes, because the smile came before the man did. It was a Thursday at the tail end of a 12-hour shift, and I was handing off a chart to a night nurse named Theo. The maternity wing sits one hallway over from the ER, and I'd walked through it 100 times without a second thought. Paige had delivered 3 weeks earlier, and half the Bishop side of town had been parading through with balloons and casserole dishes ever since. I knew Carol would be there. I had not braced for her planting herself directly in my path like she'd been rehearsing all afternoon. She looked me over, scrubs and tired eyes and all, and her chin came up before the words did. Theo went still beside me. A passing aide slowed her steps. My thumb found the thin gold watch on my wrist, the one that was my grandmother's, and pressed against its face the way I've done since I was a girl, waiting out something I couldn't change yet. I didn't raise my voice. I'd learned a long time ago that the loudest person in any room is usually the one with the least truth to stand on. Is that what you believe? I asked again, softer. Carol blinked. She'd come for tears, or rage, or at the very least a flinch. She got none of it. Somewhere down the hall, a set of automatic doors hissed open. I didn't turn to look yet. I didn't know who was walking through them. I just knew, in my bones, that I had already set something in motion that no one in that hallway could stop. Here's what you need to understand about me before the rest of this makes sense. I grew up in a farm town in southern Ohio, the kind of place where everybody's business becomes everybody's gospel by Sunday. My mother cleaned houses. My father drove a feed truck until his back finally quit on him. I worked 2 jobs through college and another 2 through medical school, and somewhere in there I picked up a belief that ran my whole life like scripture: do good work quietly, and the truth sorts itself out eventually. People see who you really are. I believed that the way some people believe in luck. It made me good in a trauma bay, where panic isn't an option and explaining yourself isn't either. You just fix what's in front of you and move to the next thing. The hospital smell, that clean cotton and antiseptic smell that clings to everything, used to settle me the moment I walked through the doors. It meant I was somewhere I was good. Somewhere nobody had ever called me hollow. But the same instinct that kept my hands steady over a bleeding patient had a shadow side. I carried things alone. I didn't ask for help. And when people started telling a story about me that was a lie, I made the one mistake a quiet woman can't afford to make. I trusted that staying quiet would be enough to fix it. I married Mark Bishop at 28. He was charming in the specific way that makes strangers feel chosen the moment he shakes their hand. Half the county would have vouched for him without blinking, and for the first few years, so would I. We wanted children. We tried for a long time, and nothing happened, and the not happening sat at our dinner table like a third person nobody would name. After 2 years, I did what any physician would do. I suggested basic blood work for both of us, the kind of workup I ordered for patients constantly. Mark laughed it off the first time. The second time, he got sharp. Bishop men didn't have those problems, he told me, and wrapped the whole thing in a little sermon about faith and leaving it in God's hands. I pushed twice and then I let it go, because you cannot drag a grown man into a clinic by his collar, and because I still believed silence was a form of patience. I got tested alone. Completely normal. I sat in my car in that clinic parking lot holding the paper, relieved and confused in the exact same breath. If it wasn't me, then what was it? I didn't have an answer, and I couldn't manufacture one. The longer that question sat unanswered, the easier it became for everyone around me to write their own version of it. Mark had already started talking quiet things to his mother first. Maybe the problem was me. Maybe I just couldn't. Carol Bishop ran the women's circle at her church the way a general runs a campaign. She'd buried her husband young and raised Mark alone, and somewhere in those hard years she'd decided her son was the one proof she hadn't failed at anything. He had to be perfect, because if he wasn't, what had all that sacrifice bought her? So when Mark whispered that the trouble was probably his wife, Carol didn't question it for half a second. She picked it up and ran with it like it was hers to carry. It started small. A sympathetic sigh at a potluck, a hand on someone's arm, a voice dropped just low enough to seem private. Then it grew teeth. At a church supper that fall, she introduced me to a visiting pastor's wife with a look of practiced pity already loaded and aimed. "This is Myra, my daughter-in-law. She's a doctor, you know. Such a shame about the children." The woman gave me a sad, knowing nod, and I understood the story had already arrived in that room before I had. I stood there holding a paper plate while Carol patted my hand like I was the one who needed comforting, and then she said the line she'd repeat for years like it was scripture: "Some women just aren't built for it." She smiled when she said it. She believed it completely, and that was the worst part. She wasn't being cruel on purpose. She was repeating what her son handed her, polished and certain, with no idea the words were wearing a lie like a Sunday dress. Paige Dolan had been my best friend since we were 15, since a high school chemistry class, through everything that came after, my move away for school, her string of jobs that never stuck. 2 states and a dozen years, and somehow still the first call I made when my father died. She stood up at my wedding in a green dress and cried during my vows. So when the church talk started wearing me down, Paige was who I leaned on, with wine and the right thing to say. Looking back now, every piece of comfort she handed me had a hook buried inside it. "You're so accomplished, Myra. Maybe that's just not your path. Don't let his mother get in your head. You don't need a baby to be whole." Kind words, every one of them, and everyone landing on the exact same bruise. I never noticed how often her eyes drifted toward Mark across a room, or how she always seemed to know his schedule before I'd mentioned it. I was too grateful to have one person who didn't seem to be judging me to ask why. People like Paige don't take what's yours all at once. They borrow it in pieces, until one day you look up and it's gone and they're standing in it like they were always meant to be there. I trusted her completely. That was the second mistake I didn't know I was making. Mark filed for divorce on a Tuesday. I came home from a shift to a manila envelope on the kitchen counter and a closet half emptied without so much as a conversation. By the weekend, he'd moved into Paige's apartment across town, and the story had already been written for me before I'd even read the papers. Myra was cold. Myra was married to her job. Myra couldn't give him children, and what man doesn't want a family? Carol made sure every pew heard it. Paige said nothing to correct any of it. The 2 people who'd known me longest let me become a cautionary tale, and I let them, because fighting back felt like proving them right. I didn't post a single word online. I went to work the next morning and sat a teenager's broken arm and told him he'd be fine, and he was, and that felt like the only true thing I managed to do that entire week. If you've ever swallowed a lie about yourself just to keep a piece that was never actually yours to keep, you already know exactly what that tastes like. The story stopped being about my marriage the day it walked into my hospital. I'd spent years building toward leading the emergency department. I'd written half the trauma protocols the county now ran on. The job was as good as mine until the whispers reached the credentialing committee. Not the truth, because there was no truth to find. Just the shape of a rumor wearing a lab coat. Dr. Spencer's personal life is unstable. Questions about her judgment. Did you hear about the divorce, about what her husband's family says? A board member who golfed with Mark's uncle started asking pointed questions about my fitness to lead under pressure, as if I hadn't spent a decade staying perfectly calm while people bled out on my table. The position went to someone with half my hours and none of my protocols. They told me it was a difficult decision. They did not tell me the real reason, but I grew up in a small town. I know the sound of a verdict dressed up as a compliment. That night, sitting in my car in the same lot where I'd once read my own normal test results, I understood the silence. I'd been so proud of had a price tag, and someone else had been quietly running up the bill in my name. A nurse I trusted gave me the name of a lawyer named Ruth Calloway, an office above a hardware store, reading glasses pushed into gray hair, a way of looking at you like she was already 3 moves ahead of the conversation. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which lawyers almost never do, and when I finished she set down her pen and told me what I was describing might be defamation, maybe false light, and that it would be hard. To win, we'd need 3 things: a specific false statement, proof it had spread, and proof it had cost me something real. The harm you've got, she said. A lost promotion is a number. The false part is the part you'll have to be willing to fight about in public. They'll say it's true. They'll say you really couldn't have children. To win, you'd have to be ready to prove it wasn't you. My stomach dropped, because a normal result doesn't say whose fault the silence was, it only says it wasn't mine. I almost walked out of that office. Then Ruth said the thing I actually needed to hear. Silence isn't a virtue, Myra, when it's costing you your career. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is make them prove what they're saying. I spent 2 weeks weighing it the way I read a chart slowly, then all at once, and landed on one truth I kept coming back to. I wasn't doing this to hurt Mark. I'd had a year of chances for that. I was doing this so the next time my name came up in a room I wasn't standing in, it came up clean. I called Ruth on a Monday morning. Then let's make them say it under oath, she said. Mark's lawyer had 2 roads available: call the statement's opinion, hurt feelings, nothing actionable, or plant a flag and swear they were true. They picked the second road. They argued, in writing, under oath, that I really had been the reason the marriage produced no children. When Ruth called to tell me, I could hear something close to delight underneath her steady voice. They just said the magic words, she told me. Truth is a defense. But to prove the statement true, to prove you were the infertile one, they'd have to put both your medical pictures in front of a court. They can't swear the cause was definitely you and then refuse to let anyone look at him. That's the crack. It's not a door swinging wide open. It's a crack. I can work with a crack. Mark had spent years hiding behind his own refusal to get tested. By swearing to it in court, he'd just handed us the reason to finally ask the question he'd slammed shut 7 years earlier. That night I lay awake running the timeline the way I read an old chart for the thing I missed the first time, and there it was 7 years back, a morning early in the marriage when Mark drove up to the city alone for what he called a routine physical. He came home different. Quiet in a way that wasn't like him, short with me over nothing, and he poured himself a drink before dinner, which he never did on a weekday. The doctor was a quack, he said, the trip was a waste, and he changed the subject so hard it left a mark in the room. He never mentioned getting tested again. Not once. And somewhere in that same stretch of weeks, the first whispers about me began. I'd filed it away at the time as a man sulking over a wasted afternoon. I hadn't been looking for a lie, because you don't audit the people you love. But now, with Ruth's words in my ears, that quiet trip to the city looked less like a wasted afternoon and more like the exact moment something got decided. I told Ruth. On its own, that's nothing, she said. But it's a reason to ask the right question. Because the bishops had sworn the fault was mine, Ruth filed a motion to compel Mark's own relevant medical records. His lawyer fought it hard: privacy, relevance, anything to keep that one folder closed, and nobody fights that hard over nothing. The ruling came on a gray afternoon in the middle of a slow shift. I took the call standing in a supply closet surrounded by gauze and saline, my heart doing the thing it never does at work. The judge had granted it with limits. Because the defense had affirmatively claimed the infertility was mine, Mark's own relevant fertility records had become, in her words, presumptively discoverable, produced under a protective order, reviewed first by the lawyers and the court, used only as the case required. Maybe there's nothing in the file, Ruth warned. But they can't keep it shut anymore. I stood in that closet and let out a breath I'd been holding for 7 years. The first sign something was wrong on their end didn't come from Mark or Carol. It came from Paige. A text out of nowhere after a year of total silence. Please don't do this. Think about the baby. I read it 3 times. We hadn't spoken since the divorce. She'd taken my husband and my whole life without ever once reaching out, and now she was begging me at midnight to stop a lawsuit that, on paper, had nothing to do with her. People who beg you to stop digging usually know exactly what's buried. The folder came 8 days later, through the proper channel, under the protective order, the way it's supposed to work. I never touched it myself, and I had no right to. Ruth called me into her office, wearing the careful face people get right before they hand you something heavy. 7 years earlier, at that same city clinic, Mark had been diagnosed with azoospermia. No measurable sperm. Told in plain clinical language that he could not father a biological child. The same week he came home changed. The same stretch of weeks the whispers about me began. I sat very still while something enormous and quiet rearranged itself inside my chest, like a bone sliding back into joint. For 6 years I had carried a wound that was never mine to carry, and the man who let an entire town believe it had known the whole time the empty house was his. I expected triumph. What came instead was grief, for every pitying look at church, every "some women just aren't built for it." Every night I lay awake wondering what was wrong with me, when none of it had ever been about me at all. And then the question I couldn't unask rose up on its own. If Mark could not father a child 7 years ago, the baby boy Carol had bragged about by the elevators, the son Mark was parading through that maternity ward, could not be his. A man with that diagnosis almost never fathers a child the natural way. Which left exactly 2 possibilities. The clinic had been catastrophically wrong, or the baby everyone in town believed was a bishop had been fathered by someone else entirely. Paige's midnight text suddenly made horrible, perfect sense. She wasn't worried about hurting Mark's feelings. She was worried about what a courtroom full of medical records might drag into the light. She knew exactly whose baby it was. The man who walked through that hospital door was named Daniel Reyes. During the months Paige and Mark were getting together, while Mark was still letting the whole town call his wife the broken one, Paige had also been involved with Daniel, a quiet man who'd believed it was more than it turned out to be. When she chose Mark, she cut him off completely, blocked his number, never mentioned a due date, gambled he'd simply vanish. The timing never sat right with him, though, and he kept asking quiet questions until one slipped loose that morning: the hospital, the date, and he came to see the child he suspected was his. Carol, smug by the elevators, certain her son's perfect new life had finally proven me worthless. And 5 steps behind her, walking straight into that room, the living proof that the perfect life had been built on the same kind of lie they'd buried me under for 6 straight years. I didn't engineer that moment. I just asked Carol a question, and a door opened on its own. Mark knew. That's the part that turns this from sad into unforgivable. He'd known for 7 years he couldn't father a child, which meant he knew the moment Paige told him she was pregnant that the baby wasn't his, and he took it anyway. He stood in front of his mother and his church and his entire small world and let them believe he'd finally made the son his barren first wife had failed to give him. He looked at a baby he knew couldn't be his and saw, first and foremost, a prop. When Ruth told me Mark's lawyer had gone quiet, no more motions, just a request to discuss resolving things, I understood exactly why. He wasn't afraid of losing the lawsuit anymore. He was afraid of what it would say out loud about the son he'd been showing off for half a year. Carol came to my apartment the Sunday before the hearing, in her church clothes, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. She didn't apologize. She asked me to drop it, not for Mark, she said, for the family, for the baby, for the name. And for one breath I felt for her, a woman who'd been lied to by her own son for 7 years and loved him too much to ever once doubt him. Then she said it again, the line she'd carried for years, except this time it came out as a plea instead of a verdict. Some women just aren't built for it, Myra. Why drag everyone through the mud? And I understood that, even standing on the edge of the truth, she'd rather protect the lie than let it go. Carol, I said quietly, go home. The mud was never mine. Mark's lawyer offered a quiet settlement after that, money, a private retraction to the hospital board, my name restored, if I agreed to seal everything forever. By the numbers, it was everything I'd said I wanted. I told Ruth no. Not out of spite. A private truth was just a quieter version of the same lie. They'd said it about me out loud, in churches, at potlucks, where everyone could hear it. The correction had to live in that same room. I'm not going to whisper an apology for a wound he handed me, I told her. I'll say it once where it counts, and then I'm done carrying it. Ruth capped her pen. Then we go to court, she said. Where's something you can breathe in? The courthouse filled the way small towns always fill a room. Board members come to see what they'd gotten wrong. Church women who'd nodded along to Carol's pity for years. Carol rigid in the second row. Mark pale beside his lawyer in a suit that didn't fit him anymore. And Paige near the back, holding herself still while Daniel sat 2 rows behind her, close enough that she could feel him without turning around. Ruth never raised her voice once. She built it the way you build a diagnosis, one finding at a time, the statements, the dates, the harm, and then the defense's own claim that the infertility was mine. Under the protective order, only the necessary line was read aloud. 7 years ago, Mark Bishop had been diagnosed with a condition that made fathering a biological child medically impossible. The room changed temperature. Ruth noted, plainly, that the paternity of the child now at issue in a related proceeding had not been supported by genetic testing. That was when Mark came out of his chair. That's not, you can't. His voice cracked clean across the courtroom before the judge told him to sit. Carol was on her feet too, saying my name like an accusation, and then the words came spilling out of her, the only ones she had left. Some women just aren't built for it, she cried, fingers shaking, pointed straight at me. Some women just aren't. She couldn't even finish it a second time. I stood up slowly. I'd waited 7 years. I wasn't going to rush the last 30 seconds of it. You're right, Carol, I said, and the whole room went silent around the sound of my own voice. Flat and clear, the voice I used to tell a family something true and hard. One person in this marriage was never built to have children. I let it land. I looked at Mark, then back at her. The file only ever had his name on it. Carol's hand dropped to her side. Mark put his face in his hands. The church women who'd nodded along to my ruin for years sat with the truth settling over them, rearranging everything they thought they'd known about me. I wasn't built wrong. I had never once been built wrong. The man who let an entire town believe otherwise was 6 feet away, falling apart, while the calm woman he'd called broken stood steady on her own 2 feet. What followed wasn't loud. Mark didn't deny it again, he couldn't. His own lawyer asked for a recess, and Mark just sat there, hunched, watching 7 years of careful storytelling collapse in a single morning. The church women filed out with their eyes down. Carol followed, smaller than I'd ever seen her, no longer the general of anything. Paige slipped out during the recess, and Daniel rose and walked out the same door, close behind her. Ruth put a hand on my shoulder. You did that without raising your voice once, she said. 30 years I've been doing this. You'd be surprised how rare that is. The rest came the way these things do, quietly, in the weeks after. Mark's standing in that town simply evaporated. You can't outrun a courthouse in a place that small, and he left within a few months for somewhere nobody knew the story yet. The hospital board chair asked to see me, told me the department leadership position was open again, that the earlier concerns about my judgment had been reviewed and found to be without foundation. He didn't quite apologize. From a board, close is about all you ever get. I took the job. My first week running the department, I walked into the trauma bay and breathed in that same clean cotton and antiseptic smell that used to mean safety because it was the only place nobody called me hollow. It smelled different now. It smelled like something I'd earned back, not a place I was hiding in. Carol lost the thing she'd built her whole self around, not because I said one word against her at that church, but because the truth was simply too big to keep out of a town that size. The women's circle she'd run for 30 years quietly moved on without her, and I felt a small, real sadness about that, the kind you feel for someone who chose the lie right up until it took everything from her anyway. Paige and Daniel worked out the matter of the baby through the courts, the proper way, and I hope, for that child's sake, they found something steady on the other side of it. He didn't ask for any of this. Paige and I never spoke again. Some friendships don't break. They just turn out never to have been what you thought they were, and you set them down with everything else. I wrote Carol one short note afterward. Not angry, not long. I won't carry your son's lie anymore, I wrote. You shouldn't either. I never expected a reply and never got one. But writing it closed something. That night I slid my grandmother's watch off my wrist and held it, thinking about what she used to say, that patience isn't waiting, it's knowing the right moment when it finally comes. I'd waited 7 years for mine. It came, and I met it, and the time that watch had been quietly counting wasn't borrowed against some future reckoning anymore. It was just mine. The whole rest of my life, finally, entirely mine. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. The truth doesn't shout, and it doesn't chase. It waits, patient as a watch, for the day someone finally stops being afraid and asks the right question out loud. 6 years of carrying a name that was never mine, undone by one quiet question I almost didn't ask. If you've ever been told you were the broken one, let this be your sign to set it down. Tell your truth where it counts once and then walk away from it for good. If this one reached you, send it to someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.